And now I would like to introduce today's special guest. The term think globally, act locally has been associated with the global environmental movement for several years now. And while its origins have been attributed to several people, including David Bauer, the founder of Friends of the Earth, an international network of grassroots environmental groups, all agree with the concept behind it. The concept being that action at the individual and local level is the first step towards solving today's global environmental challenges, challenges that otherwise might seem overwhelming. For most people, the first step in taking action at the local level is to begin talking about local issues. Looking at the Globe and Mail and other leading media in this country over the last few months, it's clear that Canadians have been doing a lot of talking about the environment and our climate. And in fact, all the polls indicate that it is our number one concern. The challenge for most of us is in knowing what to do next. Luckily, our guest today is here to listen to our concerns and also to provide some suggestions. For 30 years, Dr. David Suzuki has been the face of Canadian environmentalism. He's known to millions as the host of the popular CBC television series, The Nature of Things, and his series, A Planet for the Taking, won an award from the United Nations, and he's continued to focus on the state of the global environment in his documentaries, From Naked Ape to Superspecies, and It's a Matter of Survival. An internationally respected geneticist, Dr. Suzuki is a companion of the Order of Canada and has been recognized around the globe for his work on behalf of all the species living in it. He's on tour across our country this month on behalf of our climate and our environment, and we're thrilled to have him with us today. And in about 20 minutes, Dr. Suzuki will take your questions and respond to your comments. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcome to our podium today, Dr. David Suzuki.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm going to have to speak twice as fast if I've got 20 minutes, I'm afraid. I've got a lot to say. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm delighted to meet with you this afternoon as a part of our tour across Canada called If You Were Prime Minister, What Would You Do for the Environment? I'd first like to acknowledge both the Canadian Club and the Sheraton for really making an effort to feed us as much locally grown food as possible and sustainable. The fish came from our list of what are okay to eat if you want to be ecologically correct. So I want to thank both of you for making that effort. We're at a remarkable point in human history. My daughter, Severn, says that this is the most exciting moment to be alive because we are going to make or fail to make decisions now and in the coming years that will determine the fate of all of humankind and countless other species of plants and animals that we share this planet with. Will we be a spectacular flash in the pan, a failure? Remember the dinosaurs? They looked pretty spectacular when they flourished, and they went extinct. But we think of dinosaurs as losers. But they were on this earth for over 50 million years before they died out. We've been here less than 150,000 years. Or will we, in fact, prove to be capable of learning from our experience and learn to live in balance with the Earth's life support systems? That may sound like a pretty melodramatic statement that we're at that moment in history. But I believe the evidence indicates that we really are. For over 40 years, the leading scientists of the world have been telling us that we're heading down a very dangerous path. For me, it began in 1962 when Rachel Carson published a book called Silent Spring, all about the unexpected effects of pesticides. 2 years later, Paul Ehrlich, ecologist at Stanford, published Population Bomb, warning of the consequences of runaway human population growth. For over 35 years, I've been involved fighting clear-cut logging practices in my province of British Columbia, as all across the world, the great forests of the planet have been invaded and much of it destroyed. 2 months ago, the University of Dalhousie University scientists told us that if we continue our overfishing, polluting, and habitat destruction in the oceans, that all of the major fishes of the sea that we use will be gone by 2048. We know that you can't escape the toxic pollution from our industrial activity. Even in the South Pole, where the United States has a research station, you can detect toxic chemicals from all over the planet. The United Nations Environment Program tells us 50 to 55,000 species are going extinct every year. And very recently, we've become very, very aware of the implications of climate change. That's why in 1992, a remarkable document was released. The title of the document is World Scientists' Warning to Humanity. And when you look at the 1,600 scientists that have signed this document, these aren't second or third-rate scientists like me. These are the top scientists of the world. Over half of all Nobel Prize winners in 1992 signed this document. So what is the warning they're giving? Let me read you a few lines from this. Human beings and the natural world are on a collision course. Human activities inflict harsh and often irreversible damage on the environment and on critical resources. If not checked, many of our current practices put at serious risk the future we wish for human society and may so alter the living world that it will be unable to sustain life in the manner that we know. Fundamental changes are urgent if we are to avoid the collision our present course will bring about. And then they go on and list where the collision is taking place: the atmosphere, water resources, oceans, soil, forests, species extinction, and overpopulation. And then the document grows even more bleak. No more than one or a few decades remain. This is in 1992. No more than one or a few decades remain before the chance to avert the threats we now confront will be lost, and the prospects for humanity immeasurably diminished. We, the undersigned senior members of the world scientific community, hereby warn all of humanity of what lies ahead. A great change in our stewardship of the earth and life on it is required if vast human misery is to be avoided and our global home on this planet is not to be irretrievably mutilated. And then they go on and list the 5 things that we have to get going on immediately. This is a frightening document. Scientists, especially eminent scientists like this, are not in the habit of releasing or signing such strikingly worded documents. But if this document is frightening, the response of the media around the world was terrifying. There was no response. In Canada, the Globe and Mail and the CBC didn't bother to report it. In the United States, none of the major television networks covered it. And I know for a fact that both the New York Times and the Washington Post rejected it as not newsworthy. Excuse me, over half of all Nobel Prize winners telling us we could have as little as 10 years to avoid a catastrophe, and this is not newsworthy? Let me remind you of what the media do think is newsworthy, including the New York Times and the Washington Post. You ever heard of a guy named O.J. Simpson? You remember Bill and Monica, Princess Diana, Mike and Michael, what's his name? Martha Stewart, Brad and Angelina. The media are obsessed with these people and their antics, not for days or weeks, but for months and years. And I absolutely guarantee you, none of those people and what they did will be of any significance historically in the future of humankind. And yet when over half of all Nobel Prize winners tell us we could have as little as 10 years to avoid catastrophe, this isn't even worth reporting. That is terrifying. I don't normally sit on international panels because for me it's a huge investment of time that I don't have. But I did 4 years ago accept an appointment by the United Nations on a group called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. This was to be the largest study ever done of the state of the world's ecosystems ever in history. $24 million project involving more than 1,200 scientists from 90 countries in the world. Our report, after 4 years of work, was ready in March of last year. The report was released in New York at the United Nations. Kofi Annan was there. It got play in Canada in the Globe and Mail on page 3. I don't read the National Post. I don't read trashy newspapers. But it got on page 3 in the Globe and Mail. The very next day, the Pope was taken sick to the hospital, and his sickness, death, and succession pushed everything of significance out of the media. So the biggest study ever done of the state of the world, the report which was "We are in catastrophic conditions," was a one-day page 3 wonder in the Canadian media. This is, to me, absolutely terrifying. How did we get to this point in history? As a biologist, I tend to think of life on the planet in evolutionary terms. Life arose on the planet about 3.8 billion years ago. We, in the 3.8 billion years that life has existed, humans arrived very, very late on the scene. We arrived apparently 150,000 years ago on the plains of Africa. Imagine if we could go back in time and take a time machine back 150,000 years and park our machine above the Serengeti Plains and look down. Can you imagine what it must have looked like at the birth time of our species? 150,000 years ago, there were still mammoths roving the planet, saber-toothed tigers and giant moa birds 9 feet tall. The world was a very different place. You have to imagine the Serengeti covered with animals in abundance and diversity that we don't see today. And here and there, if we look carefully, we'd spot these groups of 3 or 4 of these two-legged, upright, furless animals, and that was us. You got to admit, when you look over that plain and you see all the other animals, and then you see these naked apes, we weren't very impressive. I mean, there weren't very many of us. We weren't very big. We weren't very fast. Elephant can outrun the fastest human being in the world. We weren't very strong. A chimpanzee weighing 100 pounds could beat the hell out of any one of us. We weren't gifted with special sensory acuity. I mean, what did we have going for us compared to all the other impressive animals? But of course, if we sat there and watched, we'd very quickly realize, our ancestors are different from the other creatures. You could tell by their behavior. We were intelligent. It was a 2-kilogram organ buried deep in our skulls that was the key to our survival, that compensated for the lack of our physical or sensory abilities. The human brain was our survival strategy or attribute, and it endowed us with a tremendous memory. No other mammal has the memory capacity of the human brain. We were very curious and very creative. And that human brain did something very special. It invented an idea called the future. The future doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is now and whatever our memories are of what happened in the past. But because we invented the idea of a brain, of a future, we are the only animal that realized we can shape or affect the future by what we do today. If we look ahead and see where the dangers lie and see where there are opportunities, then we can deliberately choose a path to avoid the dangers and exploit the opportunities. And that was the great survival strategy of our species. Foresight, looking ahead, seeing opportunities and dangers, and acting accordingly. Foresight was the very definition of what it is to be human. It was our key strategy for survival. And look at what happened. In only 150,000 years, it transformed our species. We transformed the planet. We were found all over the planet. We spread from Africa to every continent other than Antarctica and occupied them. Today, we are the most numerous mammal on the planet. I spent 2 months last year in Australia, and everywhere I went, I would tell Australians, there are more of us than all of the rabbits in the world. And right away they knew that is one heck of a lot of human beings. There are more of us than all the rats in the world, than all of the mice in the world. We are the most numerous mammal on Earth. And just by virtue of every one of us having to breathe air and drink water and eat food and clothe and shelter ourselves, our sheer numbers mean human beings have an enormous footprint, an ecological footprint on the planet. But we're not rabbits or mice or rats. Every one of us has an enormous amount of technology used on our behalf. Just to get from Vancouver to Toronto, I have to use emails and faxes and telephones and cars and buses and planes just to move me from Vancouver to Toronto. And then you start thinking of all the food that you consume here and the clothes that we wear and all of the products that we have in our homes and our workplaces and play places. And you realize every one of us has a huge amount of technology that gives us a much bigger footprint on the planet. And it doesn't end there. We, ever since the end of the Second World War, we've been afflicted with an incredible appetite for stuff. We love to buy stuff. You know, it was very, very significant to me that after that terrible tragedy of 9/11, the first public speech George Bush gave to the American people was several weeks later. And what did he tell the American people? He said to the American people, I want you to go out and shop. I want you to go out and buy stuff and get the American economy going. We're not parents or citizens or churchgoers. We're consumers. And our job today has become to consume stuff to keep the economy going. You want to know one of the most humiliating statistics I know in Canada? In the last 40 years, the average size of a Canadian family has decreased by 50%. And in that same period, the average size of a Canadian house has more than doubled. We have half as many people living in twice as much space, which means we have 4 times as much space per person living in it than we had 40 years ago. And why do we need all that space? Because we got so much stuff to put in it, that's why. But we never ask, are we 4 times happier than we were 40 years ago? I don't think so. The happiness index hasn't moved over all that time. But we become these consumers and we think that that's the key to our well-being and happiness. I want to remind you that in the 1800s, consumption referred to a wasting away from tuberculosis. Today, Earth is suffering from human consumption, and all of that stuff comes out of the Earth, amplifying our ecological footprint. And now we have a global economy that looks at the entire planet as a source of raw materials, and all 6.5 billion human beings as a potential market for its products. So when you add that all up together, our numbers, our technological muscle power, our consumptive demand in a global economy, we have become a new kind of force on this earth. In the 3.8 billion years that life has existed, there was never a single species able to alter the physical, chemical, and biological features of the planet as we are doing today. We have become what I call a super species. We now are having a huge impact, and for the first time, we have to ask, what is the collective impact of all 6.5 billion human beings? We've never had to do that before. We were always a local tribal animals. We didn't have to worry about what they were doing on the other side of the ocean, on the other side of a mountain. But now we become such a powerful force, we have to contemplate the collective impact of all 6.5 billion of us, and that isn't easy. I was at Rio in 1992, and it was agonizingly frustrating to see all of the points of view and the difficulty of pounding out Agenda 21, but they did complete a monumental blueprint to get us onto a sustainable path. It would cost 0.7% of the GDPs of every industrialized country. And within 2 years, every industrialized country was saying, we can't afford to do it. I was there in Kyoto in 1997, and it was agonizing to watch the American and the Canadian delegations trying to torpedo the whole process, to watch the Alberta delegation trying to wreck the Kyoto deliberations. But a contract was made up, and the Kyoto Protocol was developed out of that enormous activity. It's been very, very difficult. We've never had to do this before. But now, because we've become so powerful, we have to engage in these deliberations. Sure, Agenda 21 is not perfect. Kyoto is not perfect. But we have to do it because we are so powerful. I was very proud of our Prime Minister, Chrétien, in 2002 when he ratified Kyoto. He didn't ratify Kyoto as a liberal. He ratified Kyoto as the Prime Minister of Canada. When Mr. Putin of Russia ratified Kyoto in February of 2005, Kyoto became international law. And all of us who have ratified Kyoto are obligated as international citizens to try to meet the Kyoto target. You can't come in and just say, it's no good, I don't believe in it, I throw it away. I know that Canadians do not think that we are international outlaws. We have international agreements, and we believe that we are international citizens. And Kyoto is one of those things. Today we have all of the amplified predictive ability. We've got scientists and engineers and telecommunications and computers. And for over 40 years, the leading scientists have been telling us we're headed down a dangerous path. And here at this moment, when we have become such a powerful force, we're no longer doing what our ancestors did to get us here. Look ahead, see the dangers, exploit the opportunities, and avoid the dangers. Scientists have been telling us we're heading down the wrong path, and yet we no longer listen or pay attention to them. Why is it we're turning our backs on the very strategy that got us to where we are today? The Nobel Prize winner François Jacob in France says that the human brain is constructed, or it's, quote, hardwired for order. Jacob is a geneticist, and he believes that our genes dictate the structure of the brain such that we don't like it when things happen around us and we don't know what's going on. The human brain is hardwired, it's built genetically to want to make sense of the world. And our ancient ancestors recognized in nature there are patterns and there are tides that come and go in the right time, the moon's related to that, the stars move across the heavens, and day follows night follows day in the seasons, and animal migration, all of those things. Human beings very quickly recognized there are regularities or patterns in nature. And they used those observations to exploit them, to be able to predict when things were going to happen. And human beings very early created what anthropologists call a worldview. A worldview is the sum total of the ways that we've looked at the world, dreamed it into existence, observed and imagined things and sung about them and written poetry. All of that is what becomes, I call it culture, a worldview. The important thing about a worldview is in a worldview, everything is connected to everything else. Nothing exists outside of it or separate. Today, in the last 35 years, my wife and I have spent a great deal of time with First Nations people across Canada and in other countries. And when we meet a new tribe, we try to sit and listen for the first day. And everywhere it's the same. They tell us who they are and where they belong on this earth. They thank their Creator for nature's generosity and abundance. They acknowledge that they're a part of nature, and therefore they have responsibilities. And they promise again and again that they will act the right way to keep it all going. That's the way it's always been. And that's the way it continues to be among traditional people. But we belong to the dominant society now. We no longer see the world that way. We've shattered the world and we see it in bits and pieces. And we no longer see in any way how we are connected to that world. And that disempowers us then, because we don't see the connections or therefore the responsibilities. And what struck me a few years ago, I saw a child for the first time in my life in a full-blown asthma attack. And I was horrified. The child was literally suffocating in front of my eyes. And when I realized over 15% of our children are born with asthma, I said, this is horrible. So we've got to do a show on asthma and the nature of things. So I said, let's wait for a smog alert day in the summer in Toronto. And in Toronto, you have to wait only a day or so. And we'll send a camera crew down to Toronto General to the emergency ward and film it. Smog alert day came. We rushed down. I couldn't believe it. Every one of you should do this. It was horrific. It was like a scene out of hell to see these old people and children being brought in, gasping for breath, literally dying in front of you, being brought in by people scared stiff they wouldn't get their parents or their children in to see a doctor in time. They would have done anything to avoid these terrible episodes, and yet many of them drove up in a sports utility vehicle. And that's when I realized, I know that they love their parents. They love their children. I know they would do anything to avoid these episodes. But because they live in a world that's shattered, it never occurs to them that they are part of the problem that they're dealing with with their parents or their children. We've got to put the world back together again and realize that everything we do has repercussions. Why is it that we spend so much concern here about the quality of the food that we're eating? Well, you know, we're having a big battle in British Columbia because we're battling over salmon farms. And when I come out east, people want their omega-3. They want to eat their salmon. And when I say, did you ask before you ate it? Did you ask whether it was a Pacific salmon or Atlantic salmon? They go, no. What's the difference? Well, if it's an Atlantic salmon, 100% of the time it'll be farmed. Oh, well, what's wrong with the farm salmon? Isn't that good? Aren't you saving the wild salmon? First of all, what kind of farmer grows animals to eat for meat that's a carnivore? You don't grow tigers and lions because someone wants to eat the meat of a carnivore. That you'd have to feed them pigs, chickens, and goats. Better to eat pigs, chickens, and goats, right? But we don't think anything of growing a carnivore in the water. Salmon need to eat fish. And where did they get their fish? Well, we have giant factory ships plying the waters of the Pacific off South America, where millions of Indian people require anchovies, herring, and all of the small fish that are swept up in these nets now, and they're suffering from malnutrition. And we boil them down into make pellets. And when you boil them down, you concentrate whatever is in those fish. Then you feed it to the salmon, and you concentrate what's in the pellets. You want to eat salmon to be healthy? You better realize that you're getting a lot of PCBs, DDT, dioxin, Teflon, dieldrin, malachite green, and the most recent thing, flame retardant. You call that healthy living? We've got to take responsibility for what we do to our own bodies. And you know what? When you grow a salmon on pellets, the flesh comes out gray. Nobody would eat a salmon with gray meat. 1 week before the salmon are going to market, the seller comes to the buyer and says, with a fan from bright red to yellow, what color do you want your meat? You choose it, and they feed it a dye to make that nice orange-red color that you want to eat. You know, and I haven't begun to talk about the ecological consequences of growing these fish in open net pens. It's an ecological disaster in the area. But everything we do has repercussions. And forget about the ecological or the social impact of growing salmon in cultures. What about your own health? So you've got to ask, is it Atlantic or is it Pacific? If it's Atlantic, don't eat it. If it's Pacific, you got to say, is it a sockeye, is it a pink, or is it a chum? Because if it is, eat it. They're wild. If it's a Chinook or a coho, you better ask, is it farmed? You've got to be, we have to understand we live in a bigger world. And as long as we live in a shattered world, we don't see those connections. Why is it that we become blinded to what native people around the world know in their guts from the time they're born? Well, I think a number of things have exploded the world around us. One of the most obvious things is population. You know that we've had an explosive population growth. I was born in 1936. In my life, at my birth, there were 2 billion people. In my lifetime, the population has increased more than 3-fold. And the population is rising spectacularly. Well, I'm not interested in whether you can keep rising like that. You can't. But the point is, every year when you're in that rapid phase of growth, it means the average size of the population of the world gets younger and younger. Well, what difference does that make? It means that the vast majority of people in the world today were born after 1950. For all of you who were born after 1950, your entire lives have been spent in an absolutely aberrant, absolutely unsustainable period of growth and change. But that's all you've ever known. To you, that's normal. And everything in you wants to keep that growing steadily because that's all you've ever known. Nothing can grow explosively like that and carry on. But we demand it. If we didn't have all kinds of new stuff to go down to Walmarts and look at and find and buy, we'd go nuts. But this is a very, very abnormal period in human history, and it cannot be sustained. But that's one of the problems, is the perception now is shaped by the fact that most people in the world have lived through this very abnormal period of time. In the last 100 years, we've gone through an incredible change in the way we live. In 1900, there were only 1.5 billion people, and there were 16 cities with more than 1 million people. London was the largest with 6.5 million people. Tokyo was the 7th largest city in the world with 1.5 million people. Human beings in 1900, the vast majority of us, lived in rural village communities. Cut ahead 100 years, there are now 6 billion human beings, but over 400 cities with more than 1 million people. The 10 largest cities in the year 2000 all had more than 11 million people. Tokyo was the largest city in the world with 26.5 million people. Can you imagine? In 100 years, they went from 1.5 million to 26.5 million. And if you've ever been to Tokyo, as I have, that's not the way human beings should have to live. And yet we all think big cities are wonderful and bigger is better. We have become a large city species. And in a city, we are so disconnected from the real world that we think that nature isn't necessary. We're so smart, we make our own habitat. I've had lots of city people say, well, who needs nature? You know, we've got a few parks and we can go out and experience nature. And in a city, you ask a child today, when you turn on the lights, where does the electricity come from? Or when you turn on the tap, where does the water come from? They don't know. When you put the garbage on the curb or flush the toilet, where does it go? They don't know. Where does your food come from? Well, at the supermarket. Children today, many of them have no idea wieners and hamburgers are the muscles of an animal. So when you are so disconnected and fail to realize it's Mother Earth that gives us all those things, it's Mother Earth into which we will throw our wastes, then it becomes easy to see why we believe our so-called leaders who tell us it's the economy. The economy is everything. If we don't have a strong growing economy, you won't get, good garbage collection and water purification and all this food and all the goods. It's the economy. And so we elevate the economy above everything else, and it becomes our dominant force in our lives. Well, that's, I think, something that is caused by the fact that most of us live in big cities. I'm sorry, if I could just take a couple more minutes, because I got to get to the economy, which I know you're all interested in. But another thing that's shattered the world is the information explosion itself. I know that Bill Clinton and Jean Chrétien thought the information superhighway was the greatest thing. I happen to totally disagree. I think it's the information superhypeway. I think the last thing most people in the world need today is more information. We got information coming out of every pore in our bodies. Internet, television, multi-channel cable, all that stuff we got. The problem today is we've got so much stuff coming at us, you can believe anything you want. You want to believe in intelligent design? There are dozens of websites about intelligent design. You want to believe in Bermuda Triangles, pyramid power, aliens that came to Earth, raped women and had babies? Lots of websites out there. The Flat Earth Society has got a website. The problem today is that people don't know how to navigate through this stuff. There's just so much of it that you can find anything to support whatever you want. When I give talks on global warming, there's always someone in the room that'll get up and say, you're full of baloney. We're going into an ice age. We should be burning more fossil fuel. When you say, well, how do you know that? They'll say, well, I found a website. Yeah. Did you look and see who set the website up? It was a fossil fuel company, for God's sake. We've got to be much more critical. And when you look at the newspaper, look at the Globe and Mail, on a single day, you may get a report of a flood in Bangladesh, a drought in Ethiopia, melting ice in the Arctic, and burning forest fires in northern Alberta. And they're all reported as if they've got nothing to do with each other. They're each reported as if they're separate events. We shatter the world. Think of the 6 o'clock news on CBC Radio. In a half hour, and I must admit, I live and die by the 6 o'clock news on CBC Radio. Half an hour, you may get 20 reports. Means that reports vary between 15 and 90 seconds. When the reporter comes on and says, and tonight we bring you an in-depth report, they're talking about a 2-minute report. Where do you get any history, context, or anything in that report telling you why this is news, why it's happened, or what you can do about it? No, they're just independent reports coming from all over the world. And so the media themselves shatter the world so that we don't see any connections. But the major disconnector, I believe, is the economy itself. This thing we all bow down before. Want to remind you, eco, we all want to be eco, right? Eco-architects and eco-tourists and eco-psychologists and eco-foresters, right? Eco means green. Well, guess what, folks? Economics. Better get some eco back in economics. Ecology is the study of eco or home. Economics is the management of home. Ecology should provide the conditions and the principles that govern how life can survive and flourish. And economics then must live underneath that subset or be a subset within what ecology dictates. But in our lives, we've seen the economy become the source of everything. I had the Minister of the Environment in Alberta, Lauren Taylor, said to me a couple of years ago, listen, Suzuki, you environmentalists better understand, we can't afford to protect the environment if we don't have a strong growing economy. So even the Minister of the Environment thinks that the economy is the source of everything that matters. Well, I'll tell you that this economic system we bought into is so fundamentally flawed that Hazel Henderson, a futurist in the States, says it's a form of brain damage. And she's absolutely right. You know, and one of the things that struck me, and the problem is, I had a huge fight with the CEO of a company that was a forest company that was given a logging permit in the Stein Valley in British Columbia. And the native people and environmentalists were fighting to stop the logging. We won that battle. But at the time that the battle was going on, I stood toe-to-toe with a CEO, and we were just yelling and screaming. And finally he said, listen, Suzuki, you see that tree? Are you tree huggers willing to pay money to stop the logging so that you can hold it and look at it? Because if you're not willing to pay for that, the only time it has any value is when someone puts a chainsaw and cuts it down. And I was just totally poleaxed because I realized he's absolutely right. In our economic system, it's only when money is applied to that tree, somehow money is exchanged, that tree has any economic worth. Meanwhile, that tree standing there is performing all kinds of services. It's taking carbon dioxide out of the air and putting oxygen back in. Not a bad service. It's holding the soil so that when it rains, the soil doesn't erode, sucks up huge amounts of water, transpires it into the air and affects weather and climate, provides habitat for birds and mice and insects and fungi. That tree is doing all kinds of things that keep the planet habitable. But in our demented system, we say that tree is worthless until someone cuts it down or pays to leave it there. So this is the problem, is economists even have a word for this. That tree's services are externalities, meaning they're not in the economic equation. Now, to add insult to injury, economists think they're so smart that they can keep the economy growing forever. Not only do they believe the economy can grow forever, which it cannot, but they think it must. If you don't have that economy growing constantly, you're considered to be dying. Now, I have two friends who started a very successful company in Canada called Roots. Don Green and Michael Budman are friends of mine, and they've come to several of my lectures. And after one, Michael Budman came up and said, you know, Suzuki, I agree with almost everything you say. But he said, if I were to go to a banker and say, Roots has 15% of the garment market. I'm a multimillionaire many times over. I've got more money than I need. I don't want to grow anymore. I want to just stay at 15%. But could you give me a loan so that I can upgrade my factory? I can't get a loan. I couldn't believe this. I said, what do you mean? He said, if I don't submit a business plan saying I'm going to keep on growing, I'm considered dying and I won't get a loan. Steady growth forever when you live in a finite world is what the creed of the cancer cell is. And that's what's going to happen if we allow economists to posit this ludicrous notion that we've got to have growth forever. That this is a very definition of progress. When are we ever going to ask then, how much is enough? Why do we need all this stuff? What is an economy for? How happy are we? How about a gross happiness index instead of the GDP? Be a hell of a lot better index to use. So economics has become this destructive system. I'm going to end by showing you why in the richest country in the world, our plea or our demand for steady growth is suicidal. We live within the confines of the biosphere, the zone of air, water, and land where life exists. That can't grow. You can't add any more to that. Anything growing steadily over time, whether it's the amount of garbage you make or the amount of land your city occupies, the amount of water you use, anything growing steadily over time is called exponential growth. And anything growing exponentially has a predictable doubling time, okay? I'm going to give you a system analogous to the Earth. It's a test tube full of food for bacteria, and I'm going to put one bacterial cell in, and every minute it's going to divide. That's exponential growth. So at time 0, at the beginning, there's one cell. At 1 minute, there are 2. 2 minutes, there are 4. 3 minutes, there are 8. That's exponential growth. And at 60 minutes, the test tube is completely packed with bacteria, and there's no food left, okay? So this is a 60-minute cycle. When is the test tube half full? Well, of course, the answer is at 59 minutes. Been around 59 minutes, it's only half full, but in 1 minute more, it's going to fill it, right? So at 58 minutes, 25% full. 57 minutes, 12.5% full. At 55 minutes of a 60-minute cycle, it's 3% full. So if at 55 minutes, one of the bacteria said, guys, we got a population problem, they'd say, what the hell have you been smoking? What's wrong with you? 97% of the test tube's empty, and we've been here for 55 minutes. And they'd be 5 minutes away from filling it. So bacteria are no smarter than humans. 59 minutes, they go, oh my God, Jack was right. We got a population. We got 1 minute left. What are we going to do? We need a mega project. Don't give that money to those damned economists. Give that money to chemists and genetic engineers and biotechnologists. And what do you know? In less than a minute, they invent 3 test tubes full of food for bacteria. So they're saved, right? They've quadrupled the amount of food and space. So what happens? 60 minutes, the first test tube's full. 61 minutes, the second's full. 62 minutes, all 4 are full. By quadrupling the amount of food and space, you buy 2 extra minutes. How do we add even 1% more air, water, land, or species to the Earth? And every biologist I've talked to agrees with me that we are long past the 59th minute. And here we are, one of the richest countries in the world, and we're still demanding more. We got to have steady growth, and it is suicidal. Now, I have to admit, when I give this speech about exponential growth to business people and politicians, they get mightily pissed off at me. How dare you say we're past the 59th minute? Look at our stores. They're filled with goods. We're living longer. We're healthier. What are you talking about past the 59th minute? Yeah, we have the illusion that everything's fine. You know why? We're using up the rightful legacy of future generations. That's how smart we are. We think in the name of progress, growth has got to be everything, and we'll dig up and use every bit that should be the rightful legacy of our children and grandchildren. That's the insanity of what's going on today, and that's the challenge that we face today. We've got to put the world back together again, see that we're still a part of that world, and that everything we do has repercussions. And we've got to get on then with finding ways of living within the productive capacity of the planet. And that's what the challenge of climate change is, and it makes me sick to listen to what's going on in Ottawa now and all of the campaign, the rhetoric and all of that stuff, but we're not getting on with doing anything about it. And we've known for over 20 years that we have to take heroic measures. We have turned our backs on the very strategy that got human beings to where we are today. Look ahead, see where the dangers lie, and exploit the opportunities. I hope every one of you is going to help us get onto that path. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. You know, one of the things in the media, a lot of media people said the trouble with those damned enviros is they get so emotional. But you know, I've never understood that. The earth is our mother. And if we treated our biological mother the way we are treating the earth, wouldn't you think someone would get emotional about it? Indeed, if we were not emotional, you'd say there was something wrong with that person. I don't apologize for being emotional. I have grandchildren, and I know what we're doing and not doing at this moment in time. We're on a bus tour saying, what would you do if you were Prime Minister for the environment? Where is Simon? Simon there is right at the back with the white toque on there. He's our videography. If any of you have a statement you can make in 20 or 30 seconds to record what you would do if you were Prime Minister, please look up Simon and give him a statement. We've got now well over 100 people from across Canada, and we're adding more to it all the time. Now, we have questions.
We have questions. But actually, Dr. Suzuki has answered most of those questions, so
Good.
I will just ask two. What can kids do to push the government to take action on the environment?
Over half of my books have been written for children. Not because I believe we've got time for children to replace us. We don't. But what I've found is that adults, once we go through university and we get a job and then we get married and we get a house and we have children, we've invested a lot of effort to get there. Then along come these environmentalists say, look, you got to change your way. They get mad. They don't want to be told after all that work. They don't want to change at that point. And then they begin to say, you kooks, you're tree huggers and all that stuff. So it's very difficult to get adults to change their ways. But we have an Achilles heel. We love our children. And if children can read my books and say, Mommy, Daddy, I'm worried. What are you doing about the future for me? If we love our children, we don't have any choice. We've got to act. And a lot of children, when I speak, ask me, what can I do as a kid? And I say, talk to your mom and dad, the two most important people on the planet. And from your mom and dad, then talk to your uncles and aunts and all your relatives. That's the way that children can have an enormous impact. And I am living proof of that. I used to smoke. And my son, when he was very young, was learning about smoking in school, and he got it in his head that I was killing myself. And he would pull cigarettes out of my mouth and break them, and I'd get really mad at him. Or he'd look in my clothes and he'd find packs of cigarettes and flush them down the toilet. And the poor kid, I really got on him until one night I sat down and said, what's wrong with my son? And I realized he loves me, and he wants me not to kill myself. And how could any parent not act then? If your own child is begging you not to kill yourself because he loves you. And I hope children will tell their parents, if you love me, do something for our future.
Thank you.
So,
actually, I think we should end on that note. I don't think Dr. Suzuki can do better than that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm now going to call on John Duffy, a director of the Canadian Club of Toronto, to thank Dr. Suzuki on our behalf. John?
Thank you, Noelle. Reflecting on the predictive ability of humankind, the ancient Greeks devised a character known as Cassandra. Cassandra was given the gift of prophecy. But the Greeks, being masters of irony, they made sure that the gods fated Cassandra to always predict the future and always to be ignored. For about 30 or 40 years, that has been the fate of too many people like Dr. Suzuki. Doctor, your days as Cassandra, seeing the future and ignored, are over, and we are very much the better for it. I want to thank Dr. Suzuki for joining us on his If You Were Prime Minister, What Would You Do for the Environment tour. His call to action, for all of its very broad sweep, is nonetheless clear and obviously highly resonant. It is up to us, as citizens, as consumers, as friends and neighbors, but critically as well, as voters, as members of political parties, as leaders in all of our communities, to support this wave that Dr. Suzuki and so many others are generating across this country. And we have to translate that wave beyond simple awareness into action. So on behalf of the Canadian Club Board, Doctor, I thank all of you for sharing your thoughts and questions with the doctor today. And our sincere thanks go to Dr. Suzuki for being here to spur this critical conversation on. We wish you success in this tour and in your vital work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. This wraps up today's program, which was broadcast live on Rogers Television and will be rebroadcast in the days to come. You can also see the webcast of the speech by visiting canadianclub.org. Thank you all for coming today. This meeting is now adjourned.